This is just an editorial commentary about the condition of the world in the fall of 2022. If you're like me, you're seeing people you haven't seen in a long time, vulnerable people who've been slow to come out and mingle. One of the things that the highlights of media remind us is how vulnerable we are. And there's a catch. We're told to be less vulnerable by certain rigmaroles. I think everybody realizes what a brilliant man Alexander Solzhenitsyn was. Russian writer who wrote works of great density, rivaling all of his historic peers, Gogol, Dostoevsky, Pasternak. Yet he had the simplicity at times of a moralist like Thomas Hardy. He said in A Day of the Life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, one of the most memorable of, dare I call it, an aphorisms. He said how difficult it is for a cold man, for a warm man to appreciate the concerns of a cold man. I've always thought that was one of the most brilliant lines in literature. How can the existential situation be summed up between the comfortable and the endangered? How difficult it is for a warm man to appreciate the concerns of a cold man. I find that very thoughtful. One of the things that's difficult about Russian literature is that it can be very dense. So dense that Jordan Peterson said that it prejudices the whole idea of literature. Where do you go from something like Crime and Punishment? I like some novels. I don't fall into arguments with many of them. Um, but the couch I wanted to talk about was the idea of how we become less vulnerable. You see, today in St. Louis, yet another foolish, paired, crazed copycat went after a school with a firearm and killed two students. And the guards at the school were ready for something like that, put a stop to it by lethal force. And those of us who have any kind of pragmatism were cheered that someone responded in a timely fashion, timely enough that it wasn't much worse. But there are those who dogmatize that seeking security is a threat against some invisible status quo. They use the presence of escalation, dominance, a greater terror to enforce fear of self protection. And it seems to me very disingenuous to the theory of civility that really should rob those who are filled with gun lust of their justifications. Some concentration camp writers brought out the situation where you were forever in fear. What Monty Python lampooned is the bridge of eternal peril. Someone said after Auschwitz, no poetry. That's a little extreme, but it's not very fitting when the overlap of a lampoon expresses an idea from a concentration camp. The fear, the superstition, the combat rituals, attending the strange mentality of a man who has to choose between a bullet and a life, having been told the bullet is more valuable, while filled with asinine reasons and hatred to kill. These kinds of arguments, these kinds of issues come from and impinge from what Bruno Bettelheim called extreme situations. Sometimes we're told that life is some kind of wheel, that there's a yin and yang, that there's an eternal return, that what we aren't today, we will be in a subsequent incarnation. It leads to mania. Man's inhumanity to man is a decision made somewhere. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this idea of protecting one another. Ideally, we would do that. We would protect one another. We would explore ideas that endanger us. The idea that might makes right is very pernicious. But peers calling themselves friends, they challenge through the moral hypnography of nihilism, something the wise man Confucius is said to have said, which is that it's more honorable to be fooled by people calling themselves your friends than to distrust a friend. It's an important thing to contemplate when you see yourself as someone's friend. What is the meaning of a word? How do you live up to or fall by a word? Like, for example, the very important word, trustworthy. One of the novels I liked, and it's ideologically at odds with many things in Russian ideals, was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. Oh, I could argue with people who liked it too. I liked it for somewhat different reasons than many people do. And I could argue with people who despise it. I don't think they really understand it. You know, my takeaway was that the main character wouldn't have had much to do with the author. But there's so many things that attach to it ideologically that conversation about it tends to spoil it. Now, my memory isn't that great, but even the barricades of ideology and fighting for to stake out a position on a book like that. Aside from that, it was a great read. It made me forget why I brought it up. So maybe I'll get that back. But when we look at the poignancy of trying to live up to a word, you got two, and I remember now, Ayn Rand's the author of the book's formulation that before you love is so difficult of a concept to live up to that before you say I love you should learn how to say the word I so that you know what you're getting yourself into. All of the little things that you do, all of your hobbies, all of your compromises, all of your considerations should be brought under review and in relief. The I and I, your influences, I love you. Living up to a word can be very, very difficult. People say they're trying to protect you. What do they mean? Do they mean it? Do they know what they're saying? Do they know what you know what they mean by it? When I was a child, a gang of kids who, of course, anyone who's reviewed my history knows were acrimonious to me, predominantly Israeli kids, were playing a game of ring and run, and they ran ahead of me across the street and stopped and turned around, and I stopped. And I said, well, it was just a prank. And they started smiling. And next thing I know, some had grabbed me by the neck. Some Bush guy had grabbed me by the neck. We're down from where they had Frankenstein. He grabs me here. Bunker Hill, East Liberty telephone directory had a Dr. Frankenstein in 1973 for. Reagan Ron probably has show infinite significance to this Confederacy. But they clearly were not interested in protecting me. If they weren't in protecting me, I'm not saying necessarily that they wouldn't just have warned me, but they wouldn't have gotten me involved in a prank like that to begin with. I mean, I was just a tag along. I was slow to think of things like that. But they all wanted to do it, so I ran with them. They rang the doorbell and ring and run, it was called. So, what this gets to is true contemplation of what it means to protect one another. They have an Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom, where swashbuckling swordsmen come, and Indiana Jones looks really bored and shoots one of them, and colonial anti-Nazism, these Aladdin sailors fall to the floor. And this we're supposed to go, oh, we have comprehended the nature of reality. And it's a sales pitch for the National Rifle Association. That's the reason why so many people in Congress have called out the National Rifle Association. That dude Beto down in Texas has said that these killers in our schools are just living up to the voice of superior intellect that is pronounced from the NRA. They're indoctrinated. They believe they're protecting something. And obviously, nobody in their right mind thinks that a school massacre is protecting anybody. But it's a difficult conversation that comes from the impingement of extreme situations on our civics. There's this nauseating grip, this addiction to extreme situation arguments. I believe it's coming from Hollywood. I believe it's a well, what about this then? Sizing up of the situation for people who don't want to be drawn into the macabre tax and spend um, commercial consumer behavior, people who are driven mad with phobias and fears of their neighbors. All sorts of people play into it. Right, left, black, and white. All sorts of people play into the macabre. And you're supposed to stake out a position in one of the zones of extreme theory. Say, this is where I stake my flag, this is where my pin is. It's obsessive misconduct. It's obsessive. It's obsessive mentality. We have stockpiles, bizarre with weapons. The poor Muslims. You know how much they have legal traditions and institutional traditions. That's true, but do you know how much they depend on their oral traditions? We go out and raid them and make them miserable and destroy whole communities of women who transmit their heritage through the stories that they tell and the children that they're raising, people who love their culture, who aren't in position of administration to look at the details of what it means to make judgments about Islam society. They just live in Islamic society and know things that are culturally relevant. And many of these things are difficult to find in print. They're part of their verbal heritage, their spiritual heritage, the emotional intelligence that is endowed in talking about things. And we're eradicating the emotional intelligence, the cultural talk, the meaning, the preservation of all sorts of cultures because we have, and saying it's in the name of protecting them that we dump guns at them. They can't dishwasher jobs, they get a guard job. They can't get teacher job, but they can be a paratrooper, paramilitary, sidearm, you know. And it's just the endless output from the robo industries of Zappa and Bush, the Hadons, from the flapping wings of the military industrial soothsayers. You know, it's not protecting us. What protects us is the idea that maybe we'll see somebody we haven't seen in a long time again. What protects us is talking to each other about things and being wise and careful, being professional. I'm not knocking the people who got put a stop to what happened in St. Louis. Far from it, but that's not the paradigm we should be living by. We need to restore some semblance of sanity to ourselves and call out this mentality of extreme situations that's just engulfing us and leading us to make insane choices about how to treat our neighbors and the planet. That's my personal opinion. Thank you for hearing me out.